In Essential Task 3.3, we are going to continue talking about social psychology and introduce a series of studies, both partially regarding the concept of conformity, one very much considering the concept of conformity, one that could involve degrees of conformity depending on how you interpret it. But we're going to be talking in Essential Task 3.3 about the work of Philip Zimbardo and Solomon Asch. These two studies focus on what we're going to call the power of the situation, and then more specifically, conformity. As you can see, there are two different columns, one of which has quite a few boxes there on the right. I think vertical would work the best, though quite frankly, if you have small enough handwriting, you could easily hold your paper horizontally. But I'll let you pause right now before transitioning any further. Let's start by talking about Philip Zimbardo. So Zimbardo is going to get a key psychologist icon, and it's not impossible for you to have heard of his name prior to taking this class. You certainly could have heard his name if you took an elective psych class, or really, quite frankly, if you've taken a history class. His name is quite common. And it's because this study is quite well known. Philip Zimbardo conducted his work in 1971, so we're talking the decade after Milgram, and he conducted the famous Stanford Prison Experiment. And it is in that study that he took his participants and randomly assigned them a concept from Unit 2, where he randomly divided them up into one of two groups, into either the role of guards or prisoners. And what he did was design a mock prison. And after each individual was assigned to the role of guard or prisoner, they took shifts acting in that role. So people would stay on for 8 hours as if they were working at the prison and take on the role of a guard. And then you would have prisoners who would stay locked behind bars, taking on the role of prisoners. And the question ultimately was, if you were placed into these positions randomly, would individuals change their behavior to match the stereotypes that are commonly associated with those individuals? Would guards become harsh and critical, abrasive? Would the prisoners become rambunctious and rebellious? Or would everybody just kind of think it's a giant joke and kind of laugh around at the end of the day? That was precisely the question, and the intent was to see whether or not there would be any unique changes in behavior over the course of 2 weeks. And what's really profound is that the study only lasted 6 days. It was called off in less than a week. What I'd like you to do now, if you're watching this, is to watch the video attached either to Google Classroom or here on the Prezi. In order to really understand this Zimbardo study, it's really important that you see some of the visuals before continuing onward. But assuming that you have watched the corresponding video, basically, the participants underwent sort of mock arrests. They put on uniforms as if they were prisoners, uniforms as if they were guards. And after the first 24 hours, it didn't really seem like anything was going to happen. But after that first 24 hours, the prisoners began to rebel, began to ask for more privileges. And it very quickly evolved into this scenario where the guards were having these prisoners do very harsh physical labor, exercises, really demoralizing and dehumanizing behaviors. It didn't take very long for the prisoners, in the eyes of Zimbardo, to have mental breakdowns and need to be withdrawn from the study. Zimbardo himself willingly admits that he sort of got caught up in the role as what he called the prison superintendent. He was both playing the role of the researcher, but also sort of this superintendent position. And it wasn't until a graduate student came by and saw what was happening, did some observations, and critiqued Zimbardo and said, you really need to step back from what you're doing and look, these individuals are going through significant psychological and even likely in some cases physical harm because of this study. And as a result, Zimbardo kind of reflected on what he was doing, realized that he himself sort of got caught up in the moment. And as a result, the study was called off in less than a week. And if you ask Zimbardo and individuals that evaluate the study, among some of the criticisms, putting those aside, if you were to sort of take Zimbardo at his word, he would conclude that situational factors and the role of the situation can play a tremendous effect on our behaviors. Meaning everyday people, randomly split into guards or prisoners, can begin to do things like lash out, be really critical, be really harsh, just because of the role that they're in. And that even though this was a mock prison, it wasn't a real prison, that situation that the participants found themselves in was so powerful. People kind of abandoned their own personal identity, abandoned their own moral compass, and began to do things that, as we've just alluded to, were incredibly inhumane. There's really quite a bit of a debate as to who conducted the more unethical study. Was it Zimbardo or was it Milgram? And they certainly be critiqued depending on your perspective. I will add before proceeding onward, the AP exam typically presents Zimbardo, sort of takes his word for it. There are a lot of people that critique Zimbardo's methods here. Like, for example, yes, there was random assignment, but there's not really a control and experimental group per se. You just kind of randomly assign them into this simulated group. That's not really exactly what an experiment should look like. In addition to that, some rules were outlined. So the prison guards sort of had these expectations as to what they should follow. So they sort of had a lot of latitude in terms of what they could do, but there was still some general prison rules that should have been followed. So were these individuals just simply following the rules that they were established, or were these people sort of creating their own expectations and fulfilling their own stereotypes of prisoner guard versus prisoner? There's a lot of debate as to the merits of his study, but nevertheless, a really significant study that has allowed us to sort of reflect on prisons, reflect on a variety of historical topics. The big one happened in the early 2000s at a prison in Iraq, Abu Ghraib. It was a former prison run by Saddam Hussein. And after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, it was overtaken by the U.S. forces and turned into a prison for prisoners of war, which in some cases could have meant potential terrorists in Iraq. As a result of that, pretty soon after it was retaken by the United States, or taken by the United States initially, there were really significant acts of really brutal torture. I'm talking forced sexual positions, some really grotesque and really horrendous behaviors occurred at that prison at the hands of U.S. forces towards the Iraqis. And in the aftermath of that, when those soldiers were sort of put on military trial and tried for their behaviors, Zimbardo was actually called in as an expert witness to try and explain how these everyday soldiers weren't actually evil or horrible people. They were put into a situation that caused them to act in a way that really caused them to put their morals off to the side. Now, those individuals still got in trouble. They were still found guilty of their crimes. Zimbardo's experiment didn't explain their behavior entirely. But nevertheless, there are some somewhat recent and modern events where Zimbardo was called in to try and apply his work. Zimbardo is a psychologist that's actually still around too. He's had TED Talks. You can still hear him talk about his research. There's a picture of him there in the left corner. So you can still hear, listen, follow Zimbardo on Twitter. He is still active in the field. The other end of the spectrum, so there's a couple boxes here on the right side, is talking about conformity. Conformity can explain behavior to a little bit of a different perspective. When you conform, this is a term we use a lot culturally, but when you conform, you change your individual behavior or thinking to match the group standard. So if you're part of a group, whether it's 3 people or 15 people that all like one restaurant, and you might not necessarily share that opinion, but you change your thinking in alignment, you've conformed. If people have a certain dress attire that you might not love, but everybody's doing it, and you go buy that clothing, you've changed your behavior in accordance with the group standard, you've matched that group standard, you've exhibited conformity. So it can be thinking or behavior. The prominent study that was conducted to evaluate conformity was Solomon Asch's conformity study. Asch was another contemporary of Milgram, but Asch wanted to investigate the extent to which the majority group could exert power on that minority or that even single person. And he conducted what's called the Asch line demonstration, or the Asch line study. I'd like you to watch the entirety of this about 3-minute clip here. This is another one of those that you really need to see to understand. But after watching it, what you will see is that going through that lineup, most of the individuals were Confederates, giving incorrect answers. And the real question is, if you hear somebody give the wrong answer, the wrong answer, the wrong answer, if the spotlight was then on you, and you knew, judging by your eyes, that everybody else in the group was wrong, would you go in agreement with that group, match the group standard, or would you trust your eyes? Well, Asch found that a majority of people, at least once, would go along with the group and give the wrong answer. As a mnemonic for Asch's name, and we'll talk more about Asch in just a second, I see his last name and it kind of reminds me of Cigarette Ash. We didn't do the line demo quite the same way I've done in previous years, but if you've watched that video, this is all about that line demonstration. Would you trust your eyes in regards to the length of the line, or would you trust the group? When I look at his name, I think of cigarettes. You line 3 cigarettes up, it kind of looks like the study. But this is what Asch found in that setup. And again, you really need to have watched just that 3-minute clip attached to the Google Classroom link in order to really understand this. But over 75%, or at least 75% of people, went along with the group at least once. meaning through multiple trials, the individual with the spotlight, that single participant, with all of those Confederates giving incorrect answers, through multiple trials, at least once, 75% of people will go against what their eyes tell them and conform to the group. Though if you do look at the totality of responses, so meaning you take all trials together, it only happened about a third of the time, which means somebody might conform with trial 1, but trial 2, they'll trust their eyes. Trial 3, they'll trust their eyes. Eventually, they'll abandon conformity. They won't conform to that group standard. They'll trust their eyes. So about 75% of the time, though, people will conform at least once. And it was really critical for the group to be unanimous, meaning if you were the sixth person to give an answer, it needed to be the wrong answer every single time. The second there was a dissenter, meaning somebody before you who actually gave the right answer, you were way, way more likely to trust your eyes and give the right answer. However, if there's that five people before you, they are unanimously all giving the wrong answer, and then the spotlight is on you, at least 75% of the time in that position through multiple trials, that person will give the wrong answer. One dissenter significantly dropped conformity. Ash also found that you needed to have about 3 people. What's really fascinating is conformity tends to plateau at about 3 or 4, meaning if there's 4 people in the group, you'll get a reasonable amount of conformity. If there's 8 people in the group, it didn't significantly change the degree of conformity. If you take a look at this graph, conformity increases to about 3 or 4, and then just kind of plateaus. So it didn't matter if you had 4 people behind you give the wrong answer or 7 people behind you give the wrong answer. Under each condition, you were equally as likely to conform. So that group size matters, but it only matters up to about 3 or 4, which can be a little bit surprising to people. So if you had 20 people all give the wrong answer, you're going to be equally as likely to conform under those conditions as you would if there was just 6. And then the final thing, it's really important for the person to be observed. This person has to publicly announce their answer. If you were able to privately respond, and Ash did these variations, but if you could privately respond so nobody knew your answer, you were much more likely to just trust your eyes and give your honest answer. Conformity only happened when you had to publicly announce it to people. When you were the 6th person in line, 5 people gave the wrong answer. You were number 6. Do you publicly announce that you're going to go against the grain and against those 5? Or are you going to trust your eyes? Or are you just going to conform, go along with the group majority, go along with that consensus of the previous 5, even if it goes against what you see? If it's public, you are more likely to conform. Private, you'll likely just give the honest answer. In the aftermath of the study, when people are asked, why did you conform? Why did you go against what you saw? Why did you go against your eyes? Why did you conform? There are really 2 major reasons. The first is what we call normative social influence. This is the last box of the concept map. When somebody conforms to fit in, really to gain social approval and avoid punishment, really just trying to fit in. I don't want to stand out as an outcast. I don't want to seem abnormal. I just want to fit in. The person is demonstrating normative social influence. So if you ask somebody in Ash's study, why did you go along with the group? And that person says, I didn't want to stand out. I just want to fit in. I knew I was wrong, but everybody was saying the wrong answer, and I just wanted to fit in like everybody else. I didn't want to I don't want to get punished for being the unusual person here in the group and giving the wrong answer. I didn't want that at all. As a mnemonic, when I look at the word normative, I see the first 5 letters and it just reminds me of the word normal. And I think of the phrase, I just want to seem normal. I didn't want to stand out. That's precisely what normative looks like. Informative, on the other hand, is when you actually sit there and think to yourself, is my eyesight off today or something? If everybody is saying that's the right answer, they must be right. I must need to get my eyes checked. If you conform and change your behavior or your thinking to match the majority group opinion, and it's because you actually begin to accept their perception of the world, you actually have the willingness to accept their opinion, you are conforming for what's called the informative social influence. So you've accepted their opinions. You start to question, like, is my eyesight off? Am I thinking about this wrong? Again, maybe perhaps people are talking at the end of going out to dinner and somebody says, I love this restaurant. And then everybody else says, oh, I love that meal. And then you're sitting there and you're like, well, I didn't really love that meal, but maybe I'm just wrong. Maybe my palate's not as advanced. Maybe they just know this type of food better than I do. And you say, yeah, it was great. You just conformed. You matched the group standard because you are willing to accept their perception of what you just experienced. As a mnemonic, when I look at the word informative, it almost looks like the word information, and I think of the phrase, they must have all the information. Because basically when you boil down conformity, it happens for one of two reasons. You want to fit in and seem normative, or you actually think the other people around you are correct. You accept what they are saying as a fact. That's the informative reason. So one final example, let's say you're deciding who to vote for and you find out all 5 of your best friends are voting for the same person and you say, well, I want to fit in. I will also vote for that candidate. You just voted for the normative social influence reason. You conformed. You changed your behavior to match the group standard. If it's an informative reason, you might say to yourself, wow, all 5 of my friends want to vote for this candidate. I must not really understand the issues. They must have a much better understanding. They must have really put in the time to investigate these candidates and the issues. I'm going to vote for that candidate because I think they're right. They must be right. Well, you just conformed. You changed your behavior to match the group standard. In that case, what we call an informative social influence reason.